Ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and we're here once again to talk about my favorite not-so-little punching bag loot boxes, and more specifically, the AAA industry and the ESRB. As those of you that are cognizant enough to read a video title are no doubt aware by now, the ESRB have responded to Senator Hassan's plea for them to institute some form of self-regulation when it comes to loot boxes, and their carefully measured and strategically tailored response was exactly what one might expect from a regulatory body that answers directly to the companies that it supposedly regulates. However, as I know that not all of you, in fact I would say very few of you, are actually big fans of the idea of Big Brother Uncle Sam regulating anything in relation to video games, let me set aside my opinion for the moment and we'll concentrate on the facts as they are presented to us to the best of my ability, and I will give you my opinion at the end. Sound fair? I think so. So we know that Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire had requested that the ESRB review their regulatory practices when it comes to loot boxes within video games. Failure to do so would result in the FTC investigating the practice with an eye toward government regulation. In that letter to the ESRB, Hassan wrote, "The prevalence of in-game microtransactions, often referred to as loot boxes, raises several concerns surrounding the use of psychological principles and enticing mechanics that closely mirror those often found in casinos and games of chance. The potential for harm is real. Recently, the World Health Organization classified gaming disorder as a unique condition in its recent draft revision of the 11th International Classification of Diseases. While there is robust debate over whether loot boxes should be considered gambling, the fact that they are both expensive habits and use similar psychological principles suggests loot boxes should be treated with extra scrutiny. At minimum, the rating system should denote when loot boxes are utilized in physical copies of electronic games. To that end, I respectfully urge the ESRB to review the completeness of the board's rating process and policies as they relate to loot boxes, and to take into account the potential harm these types of microtransactions may have on children. I also urge the board to examine whether the design and marketing approach to loot boxes in games geared toward children is being conducted in an ethical and transparent way that adequately protects the developing minds of young children from predatory practices. Further, I urge the ESRB to consider working with the relevant stakeholders, including parents, to collect and publish data on how developers are using loot boxes, how widespread their use is, and how much money players spend on them. Now, it took the ESRB a while to issue a full response, but they did finally send a more complete response to their initial one to Senator Hassan, announcing some changes. In their response, and if you would like to read it in its entirety, I'll include a link down below, they discuss the history of the ESRB, which we'll just skip over, and then they discuss their new in-game purchases label, where they said, "Today, we are announcing the creation of a new label, in-game purchases, the first interactive element for physical video games, which discloses to parents when there are in-game offers to purchase digital goods or premiums with real-world currency. This includes a wide array of items, including bonus levels, skins, surprise items such as item packs, loot boxes, mystery awards, music, virtual coins, and other forms of in-game currency, subscriptions, season passes, and upgrades, e.g. to disable ads. Beginning this spring, the in-game purchases interactive element will appear on video games that can be purchased in stores and wherever those games can be downloaded. Based on our research, 91% of parents indicate that they do not allow their children to make in-game purchases without permission. Moreover, we know that there is very low awareness of loot boxes among parents, and those who claim they know what a loot box is often do not. Now, when we explain to parents what a loot box is, their primary concern by far is their child's ability to spend money. This is why we are introducing the in-game purchases notice and not one that is specific to loot boxes. Now, they continue on further down to discuss loot boxes and their standpoint on whether or not they are considered gambling, citing a recent statement by the UK Gambling Commission. As you referenced in your letter, there is some debate within the video games community about whether loot boxes constitute gambling. The ESRB has previously stated publicly that we do not consider loot boxes to be gambling for various reasons, nor am I aware of any legal authority in the United States that has classified loot boxes as gambling. In fact, the UK Gambling Commission recently determined that loot boxes do not constitute gambling. We believe that loot boxes are more comparable to baseball cards, where there is an element of surprise and you always get something. Loot boxes are an optional feature in certain games that provide the player a fun way to acquire virtual items for use within the game itself. Most of the time, these items are cosmetic in nature. They are sometimes earned as an reward to the player, other times they can be purchased, but at all times, they are optional. Additionally, there is no way to cash out in the game. The player can only use the item to customize gameplay experience. Having said that, if parents have a concern about how much time or money their kids are spending playing games, they can activate parental controls to help them manage both. And I did personally send Senator Hassan an email, which I also stated on Twitter in regards to this, but thanks to Rolling Stone, we already have her initial response, in which she said, "The ESRB's actions today are a step forward in addressing consumers' concerns about in-game purchases, including loot boxes, and the harmful impact they can have without adequate parental controls and transparency. While today's announcement of the creation of a new in-game purchases label and the ESRB's response to my letter are a positive step for parents and consumers, I am still concerned by the ESRB's skepticism regarding the potentially addictive nature of loot boxes and microtransactions in video games. I will work with all relevant stakeholders to continue oversight on these issues and ensure that meaningful improvements are made to increase transparency and consumer protections." So that is where we currently stand, but what does it all mean? Well, the ESRB is attempting to thread a very fine needle here when it comes to definitions and practices. As the ESRB does not see loot boxes as gambling, of which they rely very heavily on the legal definition of other countries, they will of course not institute any form of direct regulatory standards at this time. This new in-game purchases label is the ESRB's bare minimum effort to appease Hassan and the FTC, so hopefully they don't look too closely at the man behind the curtain. Although it would appear that Senator Hassan is not falling for the smoke that they're trying to throw up. The ESRB, like their corporate masters, are relying on the legal definition of gambling to propel them forward at all costs, which is something I've always tended to point out the moral and ethical issues with such mentalities in the past. If you have to rely on legal technicalities as your sole singular justification, then you are not acting in a moral or ethical manner, which is at the core of what myself and so many others are against. Within the ESRB statement, they relied on the UK's definition of gambling when it comes to loot boxes, which, reading through, seems to hinge on a couple of points that allow them to skate by on technicality alone, and most hinge on the concept of what is called a closed-loop system. The idea that it can't really be classified as gambling because there's no way to cash out. There's no way to convert your winnings into money in what is termed as money's worth objects or items that do have a real-world monetary value within the game. In that UK report, they state, "Additional consumer protection in the form of gambling regulation is required in circumstances where players are being incentivized to participate in gambling-style activities through the provision of prizes of money or money's worth. Where prizes are successfully restricted for use solely within the game, such in-game features would not be licensable gambling, notwithstanding the elements of expenditure and chance." And that is one of the key things to remember there, licensable gambling. Because gambling in the UK, you do have to have a license to be able to conduct business as such. They are not able to classify that as licensable gambling. It doesn't necessarily mean that the mechanics themselves do not mimic gambling in every way. It's just that monetarily, it's not gambling. And that is what the UK Gambling Commission is relying on, is essentially that ability for a person to cash out. And this aspect has never been a major point of contention for those like myself that do see these loot boxes as gambling. I suppose as the ESRB and the AAA industry is so hung up on picking the nits, as it were, over the finer points of definitions and legality, the battle is going to be a very difficult one, as we are faced with a regulatory body that is doing its level best to protect the very industry it is supposed to be regulating, as opposed to those that it's supposed to be protecting. While the label for microtransactions is a positive step, credit where it's due after all, it is the smallest possible step the ESRB was willing to or capable of making, and it tells us very clearly that without loot boxes being defined as gambling in legal terms, the ESRB will continue to protect its corporate masters from the consumer as opposed to what they're supposed to be doing. But then again, the sky is blue after all. That is what you get when you have a rating system run by a lobbyist group that works for and is run by the very industry it was set up to regulate. But as always, please do let me know what you think down in the comments below. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I'll see you next time. If you like what I do on this channel and would like to see the channel go full-time, consider donating on Patreon or PayPal, as well as hitting that subscribe button and following me on social media. Links to everything are in the description down below.